Dr. Mark Changizi here through Science Moment. Today, I was going to talk about the case of Leah Thomas as a great example of a mass hysteria. And unlike the one that we've been talking about for the last year and a half, or it's been going on for 2 years, but I've been talking about for the last year and a half when I restarted this series, unlike the COVID collective hysteria that occurred, or really, I would say 75 to 80 to 90% of the world really fell into it and were part of the delusion and came to have virtue signals and virtue positions like that masks work and things like this. And again, we've talked about a lot of these things only work as signals of membership when they're potentially irrational, or the folks from the outside can say, look, I can totally see this doesn't work. But at least in the case of masks, you say, well, there's an argument, at least from the cooties point of view, or from the spittle point of view, that it blocks, and people have this, as I've talked about, have this natural, instinctive sense that that's how infectiousness spreads. It transmits through sort of, slightly visible cough-like stuff. So, but it need not be the case that a virtue signal is even remotely sensible, even having a story. It need not be the case that you have 70, 80, or 90% of the population that's involved in the mass delusion in order for it to nevertheless affect society considerably. In the case, and this is why the case of Leah Thomas is, this is the transgender woman, was a man, became a woman, and is competing in women's swimming, and just won the college collegiate championship. So, what's brilliant about this is that I've talked about this before. This is a position. This is a virtue position that trans women should be in women's sports. That wears its counter argument on its sleeve. It is really at the limits in terms of what you can imagine even telling a story to justify it. It's so obviously unfair that almost no one really probably holds this position. I think when they did some polls a few months ago, there was maybe 30% that agreed with the position, and the other 2/3 did not. And I would suspect that even that 30% or so is feeling morally obliged to to say, yeah, I agree, because they're part of a group. And they don't want to be looked at as dumb, and they're in that group. If you say you don't believe that trans women should be competing in women's sports, you're viewed as dumb and unclean and racist, homophobe, sexist, all the kinds of witches. You're basically an unclean witch, the modern variants of these things. So they even on a private anonymous poll, their body just will prevent them. But I would suspect that there's very few that truly believe it, unlike the case for masks and lockdowns and mandates, and where significant portions of the population came to believe these things. And the moral of this is it doesn't take much. The people that are behind, and I think the people there are people in this sort of collective hysteria thinking that that's okay to have trans women in women's sports. And let's say they could be just 2%, 1% of the population, and these are certain intellectuals, certain I don't even know who the members are, but I bet they're academics. There are certain kinds of intellectuals that have made really twisted kinds of arguments about why it's totally justifiable, and you can, the smarter you are, the more you can come up with BS to defend it. And those are the folks that they probably truly believe it. They've really convinced themselves. So I as usual, people in collective hysterias believe what they say most of the time. Often when they're lying for the good, because it's a white lie to further their ends, which they think are good. But I really don't think that's 30%. I would suspect that the real folks that are in the delusion in this case are just 1%, 2%, and you've got the other 28%, which are just of that 30%. That are just going along because they don't want to look stupid. And that's still all you need to cause societal damage. Here you've got women's sports, which right now it's not being wrecked. There are some small pockets of it that are being hurt significantly. You can imagine over the years, if this didn't get pushed back, and I think it is going to get pushed back, that women's sports would just be trans men just dominating it, because trans men will just dominate all of those fields. So the point here that I want to emphasize, this is a great example where you have the most almost the most absurd, the king is wearing transparent clothes, sort of, the king is naked kind of cases where nobody was willing to say it, except for the child who just blurts it out. It need not be very many people that have this view, and it could be utterly ridiculous, which again is what is selected for in these kinds of communities and narratives, and that's all that it needs to keep these things moving forward and affecting and hurting society. And the answer is, don't be amongst those 30% that are keeping their mouth shut. Say what you feel. Say what's true. But as we've talked about before, don't even bother arguing about it. This is, again, the positions they have are selected for by virtue of the community selection pressures to be self-contradictory and irrational. All that you need to do is just show confidence, say, look, I'm not part of that group and I think that's ridiculous. And the more people that do that, the more that it can wisp away these kinds of powers that those virtue positions have. That was your science moment.